Good morning and welcome to Westminster Presbyterian Church's Adult Ed session for this first Sunday of Advent. Happy Advent to you. I'm especially excited about this topic for Advent because such a big part of the season is understanding how God is embodied in marginalized communities. And so we actually had a different speaker slated today, but due to family emergency, wasn't able to make it. Austen agreed to prepare some material for us to reflect on. I'll tell you a little bit about Austen here. Austen Hartke is the author of Transforming: The Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians, a book on theology and personal narratives published by Westminster John Knox Press in 2018. He is also the founder and director of Transmission Ministry Collective, an online community dedicated to the spiritual care, faith formation, and leadership potential of transgender and gender-expansive Christians. He is a graduate of Luther Seminary's Master of Arts program in Old Testament Hebrew Bible Studies and is the winner of the 2014 John Milton Prize in Old Testament Writing from the same institution. Austen's talk today is on getting curious about gender diversity. We're going to hear a video from Austen. It's about half an hour. And then after that, Austen has sent us a series of questions for conversation here in this room and also with our online audience. If someone could volunteer to run the mic, that would be helpful for me. Is anyone? Thanks, Matt. I can ask questions, and then that way I can receive them on the live stream as well as we can hear from you too. So we'll begin with Austen's video and go from there.
Hello, friends. My name is Austen Hartke. I am so excited to be here with you today via recording, via video. Thank you so much, first of all, to Rachel and to Matt Skinner for inviting me and asking me to come share a little bit with you. I'm excited to give you some information and then hopefully to sort of help you get going on some good conversation. So today's topic is getting curious about gender diversity. So I'm going to pull up my slides here so you can see them, and we'll get going. So you can peek into the next slide there. When we're talking about getting curious about gender diversity, we have to break this down a little bit. First, we have to ask, what is gender diversity, right? And then we have to ask, what is gender? So that's the first question that I want us to think about this morning is, what is gender? What does that mean? Depending on what sort of academic background you might have or what kind of work you do, you might think of gender in a specific way. So if you are a biologist, you're going to kind of see gender a specific way. If you're a psychologist, you're going to see gender a certain way. If you're a sociologist or an anthropologist, you're going to see gender a different way. So there's lots of different ways to understand what gender is because we're very, human beings are complex. And anytime we try to distill complex human experiences into an easy to digest formula or model, it's always going to be imperfect, right? So when we're talking about this question, what is gender? The model that I'm going to show you tries to bring in a whole bunch of different ways of understanding things. This is sometimes called the biopsychosocial model, or a biopsychosocial model, because it brings in things from biology, from psychology, from sociology to help us understand what gender is and how it works. So, given that background, what is gender? This model that I'm showing you thinks about gender as having three different facets. So the three facets are identity, expression, and body. These are the three different facets. And they are interrelated. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that works. But here's just a little bit about these things. So first of all, we have our bodies, right? Everybody has a body. When we're talking about gender and things that are gendered, our bodies are gendered in specific ways based on our internal and external reproductive organs, our chromosomes, our hormone levels, and our brain matter. So all of these are part of the body section of the equation. Now, when you are born, you usually are assigned a gender or assigned a sex based on one part of this body category, which is just your external reproductive organs. So that's pretty much all the doctor looks at. Usually, at when you're born or before you're born on an ultrasound. the doctor or the technician or whoever will say, it's a boy or it's a girl. And that's usually how most of our bodies are gendered. We're kind of given this assigned gender, assigned sex based on our external reproductive organs. But that's not all that goes into this facet, right? There's lots of other things happening here. So hold on to that. We're going to talk more about it. The second facet is our gender identity. So that's your internal self-perception and experience of being female, male, both, or neither. So your internal experience, your internal sense of self. So sometimes people, in the past, there has been kind of a move to separate these two things and to call the body section sex and to call the gender identity part gender. So we kind of said sex is what's in your pants and gender is what's in your head, right? And that was one way of breaking down this understanding of gender. It's not wrong to use that way of breaking it down, or it's not wrong to use that as a way to explain gender, but it misses a lot of the complexities, which is why I personally like this model a lot more. So your gender identity, of course, happens in your brain. Now, where is your brain? Well, it's in your body, right? So that's one example of the way that these two facets, for instance, are very, very interrelated. Your gender identity is something that happens in your brain, but because your brain is part of your body, it's also affected by things like your hormone levels, right? So these are not like discrete things that are easy to pull apart. Thirdly, we have your gender expression. And this is the way that you show your gender to others through clothing, hair, mannerisms, voice, etc., which have gendered values in your specific society. So it's going to be different depending on where you are and depending on when you are, it'll be different. It can also include specific gender roles that you may take on. So all these things are about how we do gender in society, how we show our gender in public, or even show it to ourselves in a mirror, right? So all of these things, when we kind of think about bio, psycho, social, these are the three parts, right? Your body is the bio part, your gender identity is the psychology part, and your gender expression is the sociological part. So all of these have to do with gender. So just a couple more things about our bodies here. You might hear the body part of this equation sometimes referred to as somebody's assigned sex, which is kind of what I said earlier. All people have an assigned sex based on a visual examination of their external genitalia at or before birth. So like I said, most people kind of get it's a boy or it's a girl based on this one part of their body. However, most people are endosex, meaning that they have sex characteristics that can be clearly assigned as either male or female. But about 1.7% of the population is intersex, meaning that they have differences in sex development. So differences in terms of hormone production and receptors, difference is in terms of their genetic makeup, their chromosomes, specifically their sex chromosomes, differences in terms of the way that their bodies are formed and the kinds of reproductive systems that they have. So about 1.7% of the population is intersex. So when we're thinking about all of these parts, there are differences and variations all over the place. Variations in our bodies, variations in how we understand our gender, and of course there are many, many cultural variations of how we do gender in the world. So lots of variation all over the place. So we use the phrase gender diversity to talk about the variety of ways that people embody, experience, and express their gender. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about gender diversity, is like the wide spectrum of ways that people do things and that people understand each other and the way that we have bodies in the world. So another question that I often get asked when I talk about these things is gender diversity new? Is this something that is new? Because when we're talking about, people might say, well, I've never heard of anybody who's intersex before. Like, I didn't know that was a thing. Or we're going to talk more about transgender folks here in a minute. And they'll say, well, there's so many more transgender folks than there used to be. Like, this must be totally new. And it's not. There's actually a lot of really interesting history behind gender diversity. So just a couple of examples here. We've got Hatshepsut, who was a reigning pharaoh in Egypt for 21 years. Hatshepsut was assigned female at birth, but she wore all the masculine clothing and took on the masculine roles that went with kingship. She was also known for being one of the most prolific builders and what's the word when you patron of the arts. If you go to a museum today and see Egyptian artifacts, a lot of them were made during her reign. So an interesting thing about Hatshepsut is like this gender variation that she had, right? She was assigned female at birth, but she took on all of these male roles and male parts of gender expression as the pharaoh. And you can see, for instance, in this statue of Hatshepsut, she would wear this sort of like fake beard that kind of went along with what the pharaohs wore at the time. So she's really interesting. And so the question then might be, was she taking this on because only men could be pharaohs, theoretically, and she felt pressured into that in order to take on this role? Or was this something that she actually more specifically identified with? Like, why did she do this? And of course, the answer is we don't know. We don't have enough information to guess. But she is an example of a person who expressed their gender and did gender in a different way other than what would have been assumed for her assigned sex. So she's an interesting person to read more about. Similarly, you can talk about the Gala, who were gender expansive clergy people in the temples of Inanna in ancient Sumer. In ancient Sumer, we had the specific goddess Inanna, and a whole bunch of the people that served in her temple were, it basically didn't matter. People of all genders appeared to have been part of this religious tradition, but once you joined, your assigned sex was no longer relevant. So in terms of how people were expected to dress or act, gender roles weren't a thing in terms of what was expected or what was required. However, from what we understand from the sort of historical record, a lot of the clergy people from this particular religious faction would express their gender in more feminine ways, even if they were people who were assigned male at birth. So this is kind of an interesting thing that scholars will look back and kind of say, like, was Inanna sort of a goddess that you could worship regardless of gender? And so that allowed people who may have identified as a gender other than their assigned sex. Would this have been a refuge or a haven for them, perhaps? And that's why people ended up there. So we don't really know what was going on with this particular religious group of people in ancient Sumer. But we know that there were people that were part of this religious order that would dress and act in social roles that were different from their assigned sex. There's some really interesting, we could talk for ages about like the ancient Hebrew people and their interactions with people that maybe came from this similar cult to this, and how that interacted in our Old Testament scriptures or our Hebrew Bible scriptures. But that's like a whole other conversation. This is just a little teaser. So more recently in human history, of course, we have other folks. And I love looking back at some of these folks in the 1800s because we have like actual photos of people in the 1800s and early 1900s. And so it's cool to actually see photos. So here we have Albert Cashier, who was a Union soldier in the Civil War. He was assigned female at birth, but lived as male for the last 53 years of his life. He joined the army to fight, and there are now some pretty interesting books about him and his life. Here we've got Huehua, who was a Tlajamana person from the Zuni people of New Mexico. She was the first out gender diverse or gender expansive person to meet a US president when she met Grover Cleveland in 1886. If you happen to be one of the people who likes the Google Doodles, Huehua was actually the November 1st Google Doodle was about her as for Native American History Month, being from the Zuni people. And so lots of folks in Native communities in North America and also in Central and South America, but I'm most familiar with North America. There are many, many tribes and nations who have an understanding of gender diversity within their culture, within their particular culture. And the Zuni people are one of those nations that like has a space for gender expansive people. That's like a recognized category within their culture. So Huihua was a well-known potter and weaver from that community, and her art is still celebrated today. It is important to note the way that white supremacy and colonialism has often erased or sought to erase gender diversity. So throughout world history, anytime you have a conquering power showing up to an indigenous group that has an understanding of gender that is more fluid, or an understanding of gender that isn't just male and female as a binary, that usually doesn't work out well for the indigenous people. So for instance, this terrible story of Vasco Núñez del Balboa, he murdered 40 gender nonconforming Panamanian Cueva people in 1513 after labeling them as sodomites for presenting as women. So in what is today Panama, of course wasn't at the time, Balboa showed up, and as a Catholic, coming from Spain, he didn't have a understanding of the fact that these Cueva people had a gender expansive category in their culture for people that weren't just male or female. So coming in with that view, all he saw was the only like framework he had to view them through was this view of like sodomites as taught by the Catholic Church. And of course that wasn't okay with him. And so murder. And a real cultural erasure. And this happens over and over and over the place. So if you are looking for more information about gender diversity in history, be aware that the victors write the history books, right? And so sometimes folks don't show up, not because they weren't there, but because they never got to tell their own history. Within Christian history, there's a really interesting background of gender expansive or gender diverse people. So one is Marius or Marinos the monk from 5th century Syria. This is an amazing story. This manuscript here is telling the beginning of Marius's story. Basically what happened is Marius was assigned female at birth, and Marius and his father joined a monastery together when Marius was young. And so Marius was like dressed as a boy in order to join this monastery. And when Marius was older, his father died, but Marius was still part of the monastery. And he sort of gained all this favor. The abbot really loved him. And so the abbot sent him away on a trip at one point. And when he came back from the trip, he stayed at this local inn. And so he stayed at the inn, and then he came back to the monastery. And later on, he was accused of fathering a child with the innkeeper's daughter. So the innkeeper shows up and says, like, this guy stayed here and now my daughter is pregnant. And rather than Marius basically saying, like, I probably couldn't have done that biologically, rather than talking about his assigned sex, Marius chose to care for the child, and he was kicked out of the monastery for it. He took care of the child for the rest of his life. And so for a while, he was living out on the street with this child he was taking care of. And eventually the abbot of the monastery relented and said, okay, you can come back in. You're just going to have to do penance for the rest of your life, basically. And so Marius went back so that the child could be raised in the monastery. And so the story of Marius the monk is a really interesting one when it talks about, like, what might fatherhood look like? And for myself as a transgender man, I was assigned female at birth. This story resonates with me as an idea of, like, what fatherhood can look like, even when you maybe are not genetically related to the child, right? But still fatherhood. Another person that has a really interesting story is Madre Juana de la Cruz from the 15th century in Spain. Madre Juana was one of the only women allowed to preach during the Inquisition. And a lot of her sermons were about seeing Jesus as both masculine and feminine and beyond gender in some ways. So it's really amazing that she was, like, allowed to preach at all, period. But the other interesting thing about her, and you can see in this icon here, she's pointing to her throat. She always told this story of how before she'd been born, her mother prayed for a girl. And she said that the Virgin Mary changed her from a boy into a girl while in her mother's womb, in answer to her mother's prayers. And that's why she had a large Adam's apple. So she had several physical characteristics that we would read as more masculine. And that was how she explained it. And nowadays we would probably look back on Madrewana and say, well, she's probably intersex, but we don't know for sure, right? So Madrewana is somebody who not only had and she also at one point did dress in boys' clothing to run away from home and to join a community of religious women. And so like her sort of like gender fluidity in her own story and the way that she saw Jesus and the way that she saw God makes her a really interesting character for us today. And of course, probably the most well-known gender expansive, gender bending person in Christian history was Joan of Arc. And she, of course, joined to fight the English in the 100 Years' War. And she cut her hair short and she wore men's clothing in order to fight. And even when she was captured, they first tried her on heresy charges, but then eventually what she was killed for was the sin of cross-dressing. And so there's a lot that can be said about Joan, right? Like, was she dressing in that way? Like Hatshepsut, was she dressing in that way out of necessity for what she was doing, for the role that she was in? Was this something that was part of her identity? Was this, there's a lot of questions we can ask about Joan, but she's definitely somebody who is important to gender expansive people today. So all those folks in history, we wouldn't go back and point at them and say they're transgender or even like they're intersex if we don't have like specific ways of knowing that. All we can say is that they transgressed gender boundaries. They did gender differently. They understood their gender differently, perhaps. So all those people are interesting to us for those reasons. When we're talking about gender diversity today, though, that looks like a whole bunch of different things. So my context and our context here is the US. So these are all transgender folks living or working in the US. And some of our ancestors here as well, Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. And so when we're talking about transgender people today or gender diverse, gender expansive people, it looks a lot of different ways and comes from a lot of different cultural understandings of gender. But one of the important things is to note that you can never tell whether somebody is transgender by looking at them. You could maybe make some guesses, you could maybe make some assumptions, but you know what happens when you assume, right? So just keeping that in mind. So the word transgender, when we're talking about gender diversity writ large, right, that is a wide, expansive thing. Transgender folks are just one part of what gender diversity looks like overall. But I want to focus in on transgender people because that's, part of my identity. And it's one of the things that I think is most talked about right now. So transgender is an umbrella term. It incorporates many different identities, but they all have to do with having a gender that is different from the sex you were assigned at birth. And then just so you know, the word cisgender is used to refer to people who have a gender and assigned sex that match. So while most folks in the world are cisgender, a certain percent of people are transgender. We don't have a really good reference to how many people in the world are trans. But it's something around probably 0.7% of people, which is lower than you might think, considering all the brouhaha that goes on. So there are lots of identities that fall under the trans umbrella. That you have transgender men, who are people assigned female at birth, but who know themselves to be male. That's folks like myself. You have transgender women, who are people assigned male at birth, but who know themselves to be female. And you have non-binary folks. So people who are non-binary have a gender identity that doesn't conform to the male-female binary, hence non-binary. They may feel like a combination of male and female, or they may identify as a completely different gender altogether. So transgender men and transgender women, I think most people kind of get like a general sense, like they kind of get that. Non-binary folks might have a gender identity that might be more confusing if you're not familiar with this sort of outside the two-box system sort of identity. And so I want to talk a little bit more about that. Non-binary is itself an umbrella term. So you can think of umbrellas within umbrellas here, right? You've got transgender, which is a whole umbrella, and non-binary is itself an umbrella, because any identity that is not strictly just male or just female would fall sort of under that non-binary umbrella. So let's talk about non-binary for a second. This is a picture of probably the most well-known constellation that you might know. This is the Big Dipper, right? Ursa Major. And when we're talking about gender identities and gender in general, we have gotten, I think, as a culture, more comfortable with the idea of moving away from two boxes, right? Blue for boys, pink for girls. We've got two boxes, a binary. And we've started moving towards a spectrum, right? Gender as a spectrum. So like you've got one end over here and one end over here, and you've got a whole bunch of stuff in the middle. And we've gotten kind of more used to that idea. However, not all non-binary people experience their gender as something that is like halfway between male and female. So sometimes the spectrum doesn't quite work because it's like, I mean, as my friend M says, who's non-binary, they said, saying that you are non-binary sort of inherently puts you in relation to that binary. And if your gender identity doesn't have to do with masculinity or femininity exactly, then like, how would that even work? So to give you an example here of what I'm talking about, looking at kind of the top line of Ursa Major, right? The 3 bits of the handle and then the 2 bits of the cup. That kind of looks like a line to us, right? That top sort of line. And we can think about that top line as a spectrum between the farthest left bright star and the farthest right bright star, right? It kind of looks like a spectrum. It could be a spectrum between the two, right? So we look at that and we see a line of stars, right? However, we know that what we're looking at in the night sky is not actually a line of stars, because those stars are all super far away from each other, not just in sort of horizontal space, but also in depth space. Does that make sense? So they're far away from each other in 3-dimensional space. So you've got the stars that all form this line, and it can look like a line to us, but you have maybe one star that's here and one star that's here and one star that's way back here. It might look like it's in the middle, right? But it's really much further away. That's one good way of thinking about non-binary identities. Maybe it's not so much a spectrum or a slider from one thing or the other. Maybe it is a gender identity that is just kind of off of the line itself, is a different gender experience altogether from anything that relates to masculinity or femininity. It's a different thing, but it might look like it's on a line if you put it in a 2D plane. So this is kind of a way of saying, like, we can simplify things to say gender is a spectrum, but that doesn't necessarily do justice to the complexity of human experience. So looking at another way that people have explained gender over time is thinking about gender as a galaxy. And this might be too small to see here, but the idea of a gender galaxy where you have all of these planets that can rotate around the planet of gender identity or the planet of assigned sex, right? There are lots of different sort of space metaphors for how gender works, because we recognize that our understanding of space has changed over time, right? We used to look up at the night sky and go, oh, there's a line of stars. And we made up a story about what this line of stars represents. And then suddenly we got telescopes and we got ways of looking deeper into space. We got the Hubble Space Telescope. Suddenly we recognize how much more complex creation is, right? We went from thinking, well, all there is in the night sky are the moon and stars, maybe some shooting stars once in a while, and maybe a planet if you figured out that like the ones that don't blink are planets, right? But then when you get a telescope, suddenly you're like, well, now there's black holes and there's supernovas and there are clusters, like there's all kinds of things out there. And I think humanity's experience with gender is very similar in that as we understand more and more about how humans work, and as we listen to each other about how humans work, we find out that things are much more complex, but in a beautiful way. So that's where I'm going to leave us on gender there. the last question here is, what does gender diversity have to do with our faith? Why are we talking about this within a faith context? So a couple things on this. First of all, knowing something about the experience of transgender people in church is important. So in the 2015 US Trans Survey, 66% of trans people said they had been involved with a church at some point in their life. 39% of people who had been part of a faith community left because of the fear of rejection. 42% of the ones who had left, so this is like a reducing pie, right? 42% of the trans people who had been rejected by a faith community found a new one that welcomed them as they are. So the reason these statistics are important is because, one, they tell us that trans folks are in churches. They're listening to the messages that we put out around who's welcome and who's not welcome, around gender roles and expectations, right? So people are listening. Secondly, it tells us that trans people are looking for affirming churches. And I could tell you that from just anecdotally, I know that there are lots of trans people out there who want to be involved in affirming faith communities, but aren't sure if it's safe or aren't sure if they'll be welcome there. Another reason we need to think about this is because the number one predictor of well-being in LGBTQ plus youth is family acceptance. So there was a 2012 study by the Canadian Institutes of Health. They found that 57% of trans youth without parental support reported attempting suicide in the past year, compared to only 4% of youth with strongly supportive parents. So parental support is a big protective factor for youth. It also is a protective factor against depression, substance abuse, and other negative mental health issues. So family acceptance is so important. And family acceptance is intricately tied to religious affiliation and beliefs. So when families are connected to affirming churches and communities, they are more likely to accept an LGBTQ plus child. So we know that there's a direct line between affirming churches to supportive families to healthy and safe youth. And so this is why it's an important thing for us to be talking about in our churches today. How do we understand trans folks more? How do we take apart the theology that has been so harmful? And how do we bring forth life-giving theology? And then how do we act in allyship with our trans siblings? The other reason that we should be talking about this in faith context is because gender diversity shows up in the Bible, whether you notice it or not. And a lot of times we don't notice it because we haven't been trained to notice it, right? But I just want to give us one example here to kind of leave us with a little taste test of gender diversity in the Bible. Genesis 1 is often the place that people go to kind of uphold the gender binary, to say God created man and woman, right? So we look to this verse: God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. What else is there to say, right? So sometimes these verses are used to uphold that gender binary. But we have to look a little bit deeper than that, right? So here's kind of the version that Genesis 1 paints of the world. Genesis 1 says there's day and there's night. There's sun and there's moon. There's land and there's sea. There's all of these binaries that God creates. In Genesis 1, God creates by organizing, right? And so when God creates by organizing, God creates all of these opposites, all of these binaries. Even the animals, right? You have the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, right? Like things come in twos so often in Genesis chapter 1. And so when we get to humans, it makes sense that God also creates humans in a pair, right? This pair of male and female. But we know when we're looking at the rest of creation that there's so much about creation that is a spectrum or even a constellation rather than a binary. So we've got day and night, right? But we also have dawn and dusk. We have all of these in-between spaces. It doesn't just go from day, bam, to suddenly it's night, right? There's a whole bunch of in-between. Same thing with land and sea, right? There's a ton of places that are neither land or sea. Coral reefs, estuaries, marshes, all of these beaches even, all these places that are neither and both. And so it gives us a better sense of like the spectrum of diversity within creation. So we could talk a lot more about getting into the Hebrew of Genesis 1 and everything else to talk about like how we might understand this as more expansive. But every place in the Bible where we kind of have these these verses that are used to say people should only be male or female, and these are the kind of gender roles, and here's what biblical masculinity and biblical womanhood is, and whatever. Like, there are places that are more expansive. There are places that let things breathe a little bit more, where we can understand things in a different way. And it's important for us to think about how we can recontextualize these theologies and how we can highlight more affirming theologies because of what we saw about its actual impact on youth and other people in our community. So that's where I'm going to leave us today. I've got a couple of further reading suggestions there. I wrote a book on some of this. There's a great book called Gender, A Graphic Guide, which is sort of a graphic novel version of understanding gender, the Trans Allyship Workbook, and then Trans Affirming Churches. So all 4 of those books I would highly recommend. And then Transmission Ministry Collective is the organization that I am the executive director of. And we create support groups and events and all kinds of ways for transgender Christians to connect with each other. So if you're a trans Christian or you are looking for more information on trans Christians, check out our website there. So with that, I'm going to leave you for today, but I'm going to leave you with some good questions for discussion. So I hope you have a great time, and I hope to see you again someday soon. Thanks, everyone.
All right, so Austen left us with some, like a lot of really good questions. And we only have about 15 minutes. So I think he divided them into 2 reflection sort of themes. One is reflecting on our own gender experiences, and then the other is reflecting on gender and our faith. And so I think what I'll do is I'll read through the questions reflecting on our gender experiences, and then just offer wherever one of those questions sort of hits you or inspires some additional thought for you to reflect on those out loud with the group. I'm also watching on the live stream. Matt's going to be running around, so if you could just raise your hand, that'd be great. And then, especially within the context of this year's adult ed theme, which is building the beloved community, construction, restructuring, and repair, I want to spend a little bit of time reflecting specifically on sort of the implications for church and theology, and Austen has given us some really great questions for that. So here are the questions, reflecting on our own gender experiences. And I just want to say this is a safe place. We've all come through different, or I hope we can make it a safe place. We've all come through really different experiences of gender and gender expression in our own lives and in the church. We all understand gender differently or have been taught to understand gender differently. And so I want to say this is a place where it's okay to try out ideas, to share things that you might not be sure are fully formed yet. And I want us to just be okay with that. We all are in a process of moving forward and better understanding. So here are the questions. When was the first time you remember feeling female, male, or another gender? And was there ever a time when you were told that you weren't doing gender right? How did you decide what kind of clothes to wear in the morning? How would you describe your gender expression? Does it change in different times and places? Are there any societal expectations related to your gender that bother you? Are there people you remember seeing or hearing about when you were growing up who are more creative with gender? Maybe you saw Mary Martin playing Peter Pan or David Bowie as Ziggy Stardust. How did you feel about them, and how did you notice others feeling? So take a minute. If there was a question that hit you in a particular way or that sparked your interest or a memory or a thought, we would love to hear it. Feel free to just indicate, and Matt has the microphone ready. I can share one personal experience. This was related both to gender identity and to its expression in the church. I was involved in a community where it was apparent that women were not fully included, but it was not expressed clearly and explicitly. It became known that from one of the elders, accidentally expressed in a meeting, that the elders had been excluding women from decisions because they thought it was spiritually dangerous for women to be in the room when decisions were being made. So that changed my relationship with that church for sure, but also was something that hit me. I was shocked. I was in my 30s and was really surprised that there were people that were still expressing that kind of viewpoint.
This is just a comment, but I grew up in a small town in rural Minnesota, and I just feel like there was no room for any sort of expression other than fitting in. And so as an adult, when you start to become aware of the diversity of people, I just wonder how many of my classmates were suffering and hidden and hurting. And I mean, we saw bullying too, but I just look back at my experience growing up and wonder which of those people were suffering that we didn't see.
I can read again. When was the first time you remember feeling female, male, or another gender? And was there ever a time when you were told that you weren't doing gender right? How do you decide what kind of clothes to wear in the morning? And how would you describe your gender expression? Does it change in different times and places? Are there any societal expectations related to your gender that bother you? Are there people you remember seeing or hearing about when you were growing up who were more creative with gender? Maybe you saw Mary Martin playing Peter Pan or David Bowie as Ziggy Stardust. How did you feel about them, and how did you notice others feeling? I know for me, there's a few memories I have about not doing gender right, or other people's sort of reactions to other people doing gender differently, and there's like a strong shame emotion around that memory. I'm wondering if anyone else sort of has a sensibility.
I grew up as a pastor's son, and my mother was a pacifist, pretty clearly. So I grew up in a household where violence and the male expression of dominance by force was not what I learned. And then I was drafted into the Marine Corps during the Vietnam War. And you spend 10 weeks being trained essentially to kill people. That was a difficult 10 weeks, and I'm glad that I never ended up going to Vietnam. But and that's an expression, that violence and force side of one view of what a male is, which I don't like, and was, as I said, particularly uncomfortable with during those 10 weeks of training.
Thank you for sharing that. We have about 10 minutes to reflect on gender and our faith. I'm going to also say that if this is a topic that people are interested in exploring further, there's a lot of ways we could do that. I'm always open to small group experiences. We could go over Austen's question in greater depth, read some of the books suggested, as well as invite Austen back to share more at another time. So I know we won't get it all in now. But reflecting on gender and our faith, what biblical passages have you heard used against transgender people? How does it make you feel that those passages are used to harm and exclude? Have you ever heard a transgender person talk about things they find life-giving in the Bible? If so, what did they talk about? Can you think of a biblical story that might have to do with gender diversity? Are there any biblical characters who come to mind when you think of people who do gender differently? Are there things that our church community does to welcome and affirm gender-expansive people? And are there other things that aren't being done yet, but that you'd like to see? I'm watching the live stream chat as well for comments. None yet, but I want them to know I'm watching. Any Bible stories come to mind for you of people that did gender differently?
This is not a person per se, but as somebody who does identify as non-binary and someone who is also attracted to all genders, which has meant that I have been called unnatural for a lot of my life, I find a lot of comfort in, and now that we're in Advent, we're getting close to this text as well, in the vision in Isaiah of the wolf lying down with the lamb and the leopard and the kid, and how this is a very well-known text that is sharing a vision of peace that is actually completely against the natural order of things. We all know why predator and prey exist. We understand that there's this balance, but this is a vision of peace that's been written in hymns and painted in paintings that moves beyond that. And so if this vision of peace is unnatural, then that which is unnatural can also be sacred.
Thank you.
I guess I somehow woke up early this morning, very early this morning in the night, and one of the things that was going through my mind was the with all of our tensions in the world these days, that a lot of our co-religionists of other strains used to, I think largely the ones that are now anti-vaxxers and very, very rabidly anti-liberal, used to say, what would Jesus do? And I think the meditation that came to me was, what would Jesus do? And with this discussion, who was Jesus? Jesus was not a murdering alpha male that we were trying to create in Marines. In fact, the only violence we see physically is overturning the tables in the temple of the money changers and whatnot. His violence was against things, not against people. He said some pretty harsh words against some people, but basically, I feel that most of his what I see, what I remember, what I have been taught about Jesus was peaceful, a more feminine aspect of a person. And I guess it kind of going back to another religious thing was what he started out with originally with the quote binary creation. God created quote man, humankind in his own image. Okay, that's one image. So we've got both quote male and female are in the same image. And so I think there's a unity of all humanity. I really love the, having a physics and math background, I love the idea of the gender line being actually not even a plane, not even a deeper three-dimensional plane, but even multi-dimensional that changes with time. That we may find ourselves, to the right or left, deep or near or whatever on that line of stars. We could find ourselves anywhere in, not to mention up and down, away from the line. And how all of this, a key point in physics is where is the observer? And the observer, we're taught to see this line, but we can observe from above or below or anywhere we happen to be, or anywhere our lives take us, or anywhere we are predisposed to be. And I see myself going back to my earliest memories. Would say that in my childhood, I fortunately was never really bullied for it because I was always big enough to defend myself. But I loved to collect. I had quite a collection of stuffed animals, and I loved making clothes for them. Nobody really dissed me for liking to make clothes for my stuffed animal collection. And there were a number of other things where I was not really, did not conform to a strictly male thing, but it would go one way, it would go the other, and sometimes I would wind up in the aggressive male camp. So I just really love the discussion, because it is, we have to include the other dimension of time, that we do change, and we find ourselves feeling different things at different times, and being different people at different times, and having all of that within all of us. That there's it's going to take a while to sort out, but this is a great program, and I'm sorry. I know we're all processing it. I was too quiet.
How about, are there things our church community does to welcome and affirm gender expansive people? And are there other things that aren't being done yet, but that you'd like to see? Somebody in staff meeting shared a story about some folks visiting our building and their experience of not being sure where we stood on this issue, and some interactions that this person had with another group who assumed differently about our views than actually was true. Wondering if, even just like, if we could imagine ourselves being in this space in the body of a person who doesn't identify in the way they were assigned at birth, how would they know that we were a safe and affirming and celebratory place? And or how might they not know? Are we sending the right message?
Fastest way to get it, that would be to invite Austen and his organization to come sit down with us, walk through our building, and help us figure that out. We do have some materials on the tables. We do use multicolors in some of our presentations, but I have no idea how a trans or non-binary person looks, what are the symbols they look for, what makes them feel comfortable. I don't think we've explored that. Not clearly, not deliberately.
Get my steps in.
Building on what Rocky just said, I'm a firm believer that if you can make a welcoming situation and really ask, listen to what the person needs or wants. And I think at Westminster, more often than perhaps is healthy, we tend to think we know and then create a program or a environment or an event and welcome people to it. I think the intentions are always, always positive and from the heart, but I think we make the mistake of not asking, what do you need? What of us can we provide to you so that you can feel comfortable? The trick will be to make sure that they feel that they can trust speaking openly, and that they're not going to be met with, oh no, that's just too much, or we can't possibly do that.
This is really simplistic, but it's based on what these people said is, well, we recently, last summer, we were looking for new faith communities, so we're going all over the place on web pages. And some churches right on their, right, the very first thing you see in their little boxes is we welcome, LGBTQ plus people. And then I started thinking like, well, why wouldn't every church say that on their website? Because, it's, you'd have to know what the experience is like when you go there, but it was just, some have it out there and some say nothing. So I think it was just a curiosity I noticed and wondered why everybody would say that. But
I want to make note that we lost our live streaming audience. Sorry I didn't get the opportunity to say goodbye to them. We can continue this conversation here in this room a little bit longer. I will say that I know some friends have told me that their experience of people stating they are welcoming and affirming has not always been indicative of the actual experience that they've had when they come. It's kind of like a switch, a bait and switch, which is, I think, really diminished trust in even the statement, which is unfortunate.